The only thing worse than the after lunch spot is the after lunch spot. But the good news is we have an important and impactful speaker to take us through this part of the afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Tom Wheeler. Tom is the 31st head of the FCC, sworn in last November 4th, I think, Tom. Interesting background, a venture capitalist, an industry leader, and I'll quote Obama on this. He is a member of both the Wireless Hall of Fame and the Cable TV Hall of Fame, which makes him the Bo Jackson of telecom. And he is actually a teacher and author, too. And he wrote a book, I'd never heard of this before, Tom, Mr. Lincoln's T-Mail, not email, but T-Mail, an untold story of how Abraham Lincoln used the telegraph to win the Civil War. So his interest in history and telecommunications goes way back. The first week Tom was on the job, I showed up in his office, sat down and said, you know, we've had this thing going on for a while about E-rate connecting the schools. He slapped the table in front of him and said, it's the top of our agenda. We're going to make this happen. Now, I've heard that a fair amount before in Washington. So I actually then noted that he had a blog this year on January 28th that said, we can take steps this year to significantly increase our investment in high-speed broadband to the benefit of our students and teachers. You delivered on that already this year, and the delivery has just begun. Across this ecosystem, it's important for people and organizations to step forward and take leadership to get the flywheel going. And Tom and his organization, through some political headwinds, have managed to create some leadership around the concept of connectivity and what it means to our classroom. So we've asked Tom to give us an update on what he's doing in his part of the world, and I think provide additional challenge to ours. Let me welcome Tom Wheeler.
Jim, thank you very much. It's great to be here with all of you. Jim, I was reminded during your comments, yes, this is the beginning. Okay? This is not the end. This is the beginning. Years ago, I learned sign, and one of my favorite signs is, which is, this is only the beginning. And it's something that we all need to remember. But what you all have done here at the Lead Commission has been fabulous. I am not exaggerating to say that you have been a driving force in what we've been doing. Yes, Jim showed up on my doorstep the first day, and the other Jim even beat him to that before I was sworn in. I've been involved with the E-rate since before it was the E-rate, and we're going to move it on. And so let me just share with you some thoughts about that, because this is an important time for educational technology. That the rapid evolution of the education curriculum, the growth in one-to-one learning initiatives, the wealth of tools that are available online, all create wonderful opportunities for both students and educators. Technology has also transformed our libraries into vital centers in their communities. And this is something that knows no boundaries in terms of the geography of our country. That what we're talking about goes from the busiest urban schools and libraries to the smallest rural schools and libraries. And I've made it a point over the last year to visit those schools and libraries, to observe how they are or are not using new technology. From urban areas to tribal lands to believe me, the remotest of the remote areas of Alaska, I've witnessed the transformative power of digital education technology. And that boils down to this, that for those communities and schools and libraries with connectivity to high-speed broadband, the sky is the limit. But for those who remain tethered to 20th century concepts of connectivity, the future is clearly not as bright. Internet connectivity, as you all know, has made remarkable developments in educational technology possible. And as the adoption of digital learning tools increase in schools and libraries, so does the need for high-speed broadband to and within those institutions. And that's why we have undertaken the challenge of modernizing the E-rate program. As Jim referenced, this past July, the Commission approved the first major modification of the E-rate program in its history. E-rate has helped to ensure that almost every school and library in America has basic internet connectivity. But basic isn't good enough anymore. And in the 18 years since the E-rate was established, technology has changed. The needs of students and teachers has changed. And now, finally, the E-rate has changed. What we did in July accomplished three goals. First, for the first time, the Commission set specific, ambitious goals for the broadband delivery capacity that is delivered to schools and libraries. As Commissioner Rosenworcel has succinctly explained, the discussion has moved from connectivity to capacity. Second, we set a clear and certain course away from support for 20th century technologies, and we set an equally clear target for $1 billion per year for in-school Wi-Fi connectivity to the student's desk. Recognizing that we can't afford to dither in making these technologies available to every student, every teacher, and every librarian, we acted with dispatch, and as a result, we'll begin to see results in the next funding year with expanded support to Wi-Fi to tens of millions of students, tens of millions of new students who didn't have it before, as well as to thousands of libraries. Third, we took initial steps to improve the cost effectiveness of E-rate spending through greater pricing transparency and enabling bulk purchasing to drive down prices. We set ambitious goals. We restructured our available resources to focus on these goals, and we began to improve operations to use those resources as efficiently as possible. It was a sound, businesslike approach. But for all our progress, our work to transition E-rate away from 20th century technologies to enable support of 21st century communications is not over. We've updated the program to close the Wi-Fi gap. Now it's time to close the rural fiber gap. So today I'd like to visit about the next steps in the evolution of the E-rate program. In particular, I want to talk about two related issues that remain squarely before the Commission as we consider the next step in the E-rate modernization process. And those are, number one, closing the rural fiber gap for schools and libraries, and number two, tackling the affordability challenge. Although the most recent step in E-rate modernization necessarily placed an emphasis on Wi-Fi and broadband within schools and libraries, we know we must still address the challenge of improving the broadband infrastructure to those institutions, to the school building, to the library building. And we particularly must pay attention to this challenge, excuse me, in rural America. The fact is that many rural schools and libraries lack the infrastructure needed to deliver high-speed broadband. The Commission estimates that 40% of schools in rural areas lack access to fiber networks. That's if they wanted it, it's not there. And of those who could access fiber, only about a third do so, principally because of high costs. The net result is shocking. 75% of rural public schools today are unable to achieve the high-speed connectivity goals that we have set. Shocking. Let me review that. 75% of the rural public schools in America are unable to get the kind of high-speed broadband connectivity that their students require and that the users of the libraries require. Now, yes, absolutely, urban connectivity also needs to improve. But the path to accomplishing that is made easier because urban schools and libraries have easier access to fiber than do their rural counterparts. Our E-rate order adopted internet access targets of 100 megabits per second per thousand students in the short term and a gig per second per thousand students in the longer term. Now, I'm not suggesting that the FCC should require the purchase of fiber, because obviously some of the smallest schools, those that have relatively few students, may not need as much bandwidth on a per student basis. But in most cases, those levels of connectivity, 100 meg going to a gig, those levels of connectivity can only be achieved through a fiber connection. To illustrate the point, consider what we learned from a school superintendent in Cashion, Oklahoma, where they bought new iPads and new computers, but they're stuck with 3 T1 lines. Or in an E-rate workshop earlier this year, we heard from a representative of a consortium of Florida schools. And consortia are good, right? They create buying power. We heard from a consortia of public schools that have been actively trying to get access to fiber, but simply have not been able to get providers to bid on their requests. Unfortunately, these are not uncommon experiences. So we must tackle the rural fiber gap if we're to achieve the connectivity targets for all schools and libraries in all parts of the country. Thank you. Yes. Yes. You know, I visited with dozens of rural telecom providers, and I know of their commitment to provide fiber to their communities. And given those initiatives, many of which are supported by our Universal Service Program, we must take a close look at all of our programs to see what changes can be made to better incentivize build-out to rural schools and libraries. Attacking the rural fiber gap using the E-rate program can be accomplished within the confines of the current E-rate structure by considering rules to provide better incentives for build-out in areas with high upfront costs. Our rules already cover the costs of special construction charges to pay for new infrastructure, but there may be ways to adjust those rules that make it more likely that school districts and libraries will receive bids to build in areas where they currently have no high-speed options. We also know that the success of school connectivity is not only a federal endeavor. Right, Governor? You led in your state to create a model of what can be done. States like North Carolina have stepped up by making state funding available and ensuring smart purchasing. You know, and in those situations, schools and libraries tend to have better connections with better capacity to meet our goals. And our rules should incentivize that kind of activity. But closing the rural school and library connectivity gap need not just be limited to the E-rate program. In 2011, the FCC created the Connect America Fund to support high-speed broadband deployment in unserved areas. The success of that program should also be judged by how it solves the rural fiber gap for rural schools and libraries. So I'm saying let's take a look at not only the E-rate program, but the totality of the programs over which we have responsibility. Because making the changes to the current rules to rethink how the program supports connecting rural schools and libraries in unserved areas is going to be necessary. It's also a matter of having sufficient funding and ensuring that schools can afford the ongoing costs of accessing high-speed broadband networks. In our July decision, we launched a further notice to determine the future funding needs of the E-rate program, among other topics. Since July, we have also made public a summary of the substantial amount of data that's been filed on the record on current school and library connectivity. And the record on this just happens to close tomorrow. Based on this information gathered so far and the continuing analysis of the Commission staff and E-rate stakeholders, it's my hope the Commission will be able to move expeditiously on the policy issues suggested by this data. But it has become more apparent, based on this data, that the heart and soul of any further modernization must be closing the rural fiber gap. The E-rate program needs to emphasize an equality of opportunity for both urban and rural schools and libraries. An equality of opportunity for both urban and rural schools and libraries. Urban institutions should not feel threatened by a rural fiber gap initiative. Indeed, the reason for exploring whether more funding is necessary is precisely to answer the question of how to meet the urban and rural needs equally and simultaneously. Closing the rural fiber gap and ensuring that we have sufficient funding available to meet all of our ongoing E-rate funding needs also means we need to tackle the affordability gap. When we talk about getting the most bang for our E-rate buck, obviously the prices that schools pay for connectivity are going to have a significant impact on how far our E-rate investments can go. It's interesting that people forget that the rate in E-rate refers to the price that should be paid, or the rate that the schools and libraries are charged for internet connectivity. Congress directed the FCC to require that schools and libraries participating in the E-rate program pay the best rates available. In fact, the statute says that schools and libraries should get access to services, quote, at rates less than the amounts charged for similar services to other parties, unquote. That's the law. This means ensuring that schools and libraries are getting access to high-speed connectivity at the best possible E-rate. And that's why the FCC's rules direct providers to charge the lowest corresponding price for all E-rate eligible services. We define this as the lowest price available to similarly situated non-residential customers. However, the data shows that E-rate applicants pay widely and wildly varying prices for connections fast enough to meet our goals. For example, take the difference between Mississippi and Louisiana. On one side of the line, in Mississippi, it's $750 per month for a 1 gig connection. Go to the other side of the line, it's over $5,000. While visiting South Dakota, I learned of a small rural school whose provider wanted $6,000 per month for a high-speed connection. Interestingly enough, however, the carrier had a resale agreement with a competitive provider for the exact same circuit for $2,500 a month. So with one phone call, the school was able to reduce its costs by 66%. But under our rules, it shouldn't have had to make that phone call. And let's not forget that once there is fiber connectivity, there's still the cost of internet access. Some statewide networks pay as little as $1 per megabit per second per month for commodity internet access, while others pay over $15 per month for the same product. The gaps can be even larger at the district level. In one state that I recently learned of, literally just learned of, a district is able to purchase internet access for $3 per megabit per second. But two directly adjacent districts, you got the $3 here and the one on each side, pay $36 and $40 per megabit for the same provider, or for the same service from the same provider. Sadly, this is not an anomaly. Why does this happen? How can we fix it? Of course, marginal costs are going to vary around the country for entirely legitimate reasons, and so should pricing. For example, the lack of fiber or other high-speed capacity infrastructure can limit a provider's ability to offer high-speed service at low prices. Or initial deployment and ongoing middle-mile costs can be very high for providers that serve rural areas. However, the data that we have collected suggests that in many cases, broadband service providers can do a lot better for our nation's schools and our nation's libraries. A lot better. I've always said that we should ask of the E-rate program the same thing that every teacher asks. Can you do better? And when we answer that question, we learn that we need to ask more of our service providers who receive E-rate funding for their schools and libraries. And it's not just that suddenly this new guy at the FCC says this is what we have to do. It is what the law says we must do. And it is our responsibility to make sure that those instructions from Congress are obeyed. Applicants, as well as USAC, have a big role to play in achieving this statutory mandate. Our data and our conversations with E-rate applicants have helped identify ways to drive down costs. One of the ways of accomplishing this is through transparency. District and state staff have told us they often don't know what the schools in the districts next door are paying, as exemplified by the example I just told you. And when they find out, they're often surprised to learn that those differences are as substantial as the example I shared with you. The E-rate modernization order we did in July directed USAC to make applicant pricing data publicly available beginning next year. There's also the opportunity that pooling of purchasing power has to drive down costs. Schools and libraries are in a better position to lower rates if they form consortia or negotiate low-price master contracts. Our E-rate modernization order took several steps to encourage consortium purchasing, speed the review of consortium applications, and facilitate preferred master contracts. The FCC has a fiduciary responsibility to both the E-rate recipients and to the millions of telecom consumers who contribute every month into the fund. That fiduciary responsibility starts with the statutory commitment to the right pricing. One final point, and I'll get out of your hair. I'm quite certain that it will take more than the efforts of the FCC to close the rural fiber gap. We'll need the continued support from state and local governments who recognize the critical importance of connecting our students. In this regard, I'm pleased to note that there's bipartisan leadership throughout the states, both state officials and local officials. There's bipartisan support in the Congress for E-rate modernization. There is a bipartisan model that you all have built here in the LEAD Commission to show that this isn't about politics. This is about students. This is about people who are using their libraries as the new digital hub in their community. Doing what's best for students, doing what's best to those who use libraries is not a political issue. Whether it's a student in an unserved rural area that's being left behind or an urban student that lacks options simply because the school can't afford to connect. We must tackle these issues together. Equality of opportunity for both rural and urban schools and libraries, while simultaneously addressing the rural fiber gap, is a big challenge. I'm confident that we at the FCC, that the education leaders in this room, the leadership of the LEAD Commission, telecom service providers nationwide together can work to achieve this challenge and to open up new worlds of opportunity for our children. Thank you for the work you at the LEAD Commission are doing to lead. And thank you for the opportunity to be here.
So, Tom, thank you very much. It's really extraordinary. I'd like to also thank Jeff, who 2 years ago we had the first Sunnylands retreat. 2.5 years ago, it was about 12 or 14 of us sat around. One of the questions we asked is, where could we start moving the system? And one of the ideas that came out of that retreat is, let's go after E-rate. I think now, thanks to Tom's leadership and all those on the commission, I think what you heard today was somewhere around potentially $5–6 billion. A couple $1 billion that have already been moved, and somewhere in those discussions is a commitment to potentially find more dollars. But think about how much money could be saved if top-down we really went after rates. Top-down. So, Tom, it's a great gift to education, and I think it's a challenge to all of us here to get the flywheel moving on teacher training, which is another key piece of the ecosystem. So, Tom, thank you again.